just what makes us who we are? How much of our behavior is due to nature and how much to nurture? And if the accidents of nature and the circumstances of our nurture have been for the most part beyond our control, then just how free is our free will? And to what extent has it been tampered with by those seeking to benefit? There is no doubt that culture does much to constrain and define human behavior, but it can only build upon the foundation of pre-existent biological imperatives. There is no culture anywhere that is born from nothing. Instead, they have evolved out of the very same behaviors that existed for millennia before the powers of self-reflection ever stirred in the neocortex of our mammalian brains. The celebrated American anthropologist George Murdoch was the first to list the characteristics common to every culture known to history. If these things are common to all of humanity, independent of time and place, then is it accurate to even talk about them as culture? It would make more sense to refer to culture as the difference in style between the behaviors that are common to all of us, rather than the behaviors themselves. Culture cannot possibly be responsible for behaviors that are universal, but perhaps biology can. This film then aims to show how our biology can be impacted in certain ways so as to facilitate the expression of some behaviors and the repression of others, and how this knowledge is being used against us. The one assumption that I am taking for granted is that people in powerful places work together for their own interests. This by now should be obvious to most, backed as it is by historical hindsight as well as a wealth of documented evidence. Although it's not in the scope of this film to investigate just who is doing the controlling, I take it as a given that there is a cohesive group of people on this planet working together covertly for their own best interests, over and above the interests of the common man and woman. In fact, their agenda is often completely at odds with our own common interests, and indeed, even directly engaged in undermining them. The second pillar upon which my conclusions must inevitably stand is something known as RK selection theory, which has taken a series of repeatable and predictable observations to derive from them a theory based on genetic principles in order to explain those observations. Much like gravity, things fall. This is clear to everyone. However, the reason as to just why they fall is still open to debate. As such, I am using RK selection as a context and language in which to consider these observations, rather than a biological theory to demonstrate genetic principles. The term RK selection was coined by the ecologist Robert MacArthur and the biologist and naturalist E.O. Wilson in their 1967 book, The Theory of Island Biogeography, and their resulting theory describes two different reproduction strategies used by living organisms, as well as the environments that lead to the selection of one or the other as the optimum strategy for survival and reproduction. In many ways, as we shall soon see, the strategies are diametrically opposed, at opposite ends of the same spectrum, and since the late 60s, many other strategies have been described that seem to inhabit the space between these two extremes. Nevertheless, for the purpose of this investigation, these two strategies are sufficient to illustrate the conclusion that I intend to derive from them. RK selection, then, relates to the selection of certain traits that an organism will manifest as a trade-off between the quantity or quality of their offspring, and arises as a result of certain environmental factors, such as the availability of resources and the stability of the environment. This can either be a larger number of offspring at the expense of decreased parental investment in the case of R-selected organisms, or fewer offspring and increased parental investment in the case of K-selected organisms. In general terms, the high reproductive rate of R-selected animals is the response to a surplus of resources and an unstable, possibly dangerous environment, whereas the K-selected species is one that has been culled by the limitations of resources and has found a balanced population at the carrying capacity of a relatively stable environment. Rather than a discrete set of behaviors, instead the RK strategies should be considered to be a possible spectrum of relative behaviors. Hence, a rabbit may follow more of an R strategy in comparison with wolves, but more of a K strategy relative to oysters. The terms R and K are taken from an algebraic formula used to describe population dynamics, where R is the maximum growth rate and K is the carrying capacity of the local environment. When dealing with RK selection within the animal kingdom, the wolf and the rabbit are often chosen as a means to illustrate the principal differences, as many of their habits and idiosyncrasies are already familiar to us, as well as the fact that they accurately encapsulate the peculiarities of each strategy. Here the rabbit is representative of the R strategy and the wolf the K strategy. So the first obvious biological difference, as already mentioned, is the number of offspring of each. Whereas a mature female wolf can give birth once a year to anywhere from 4 to 6 cubs, a female rabbit can give birth 12 times a year to a litter of 1 to 14 babies each time. Remember that R selection is designed to exploit situations of abundant resources. Their strategy is to reproduce as rapidly as possible to fill the environmental niche before some other animal does. As a result, we can see that not only do they produce more offspring per pregnancy, but they also have a shorter gestation period. In this case, 1 month for the rabbit and 2.5 months for the wolf, as well as reaching the age of sexual maturity earlier, a mere 3 months for a female rabbit compared to 2.5 years for a female wolf. The fourth factor involved in ensuring a prodigious number of offspring is, of course, the frequency of sexual intercourse, and as can be expected, the rabbit is at it, well, like a rabbit, while the K-selected organism, in this case the wolf, is more reserved and infrequent in its sexual encounters. The final factor ensuring a multitude of little R-selected babies is the nature of sexual partnership. The R-selected organism will tend to be promiscuous, having multiple partners to ensure maximum offspring, while the K-selected organism will be more restrained, and in the case of the wolf, will in fact pair bond for life and practice monogamy. A final point to mention here is sexual selectivity. While rabbits will mate indiscriminately as often as possible, wolves are highly selective and will choose only the fittest and most competent wolf as a potential mate. In fact, more often than not, only the alpha males and females of a pack will mate and have offspring in order to ensure the propagation of only the best genes. Whereas R selection favors quantity over quality, K selection favors quality over quantity. So as we can see, these 5 factors all work together to ensure the maximum number of offspring so as to make the most of abundant resources while they last, and do so before another animal does. In the case of the rabbit, it's very unlikely that they'll ever run out of grass to eat. As a result, the limiting factor for their population is rarely a lack of resources. Instead, rabbits are kept in check by predation by other species. Wolves, on the other hand, have little to fear from predation, but are kept at their carrying capacity due to the limitation of resources. The wolf must find and catch its prey. It requires skill and a considerable expense of energy, while all it takes for the rabbit is to lower its head and chew. Wolves, therefore, reach their carrying capacity depending on available prey, while rabbits never reach the maximum carrying capacity of their environment and instead are culled by predation before the maximum can be reached. The sixth factor we shall look at, which is very much related to the reproductive nature of each species, is the quality and quantity of parental investment in their offspring. With rabbits, the father's job ends at ejaculation. At this point, he's off and plays little to no role in the rearing of his babies. This leaves the mother as the sole carer, and even this lasts for a mere 5 weeks or so, at which time the youngsters are off to fend for themselves. In contrast, the male as well as the female wolf plays an active role in the rearing of young, and is instrumental in teaching them the skills a wolf will need, such as hunting. They've also been known to die whilst attempting to protect their offspring, something a rabbit's parents would never risk. Due to the reduced number of babies, the cub's parents are freer to invest considerable time and effort in rearing their young, unlike the rabbit, who couldn't possibly effectively tend to 100 or so offspring a year and has no need to, as the only real skills a rabbit needs is to eat grass, run when predators approach, and reproduce as often as possible. Number 7. Loyalty to in-group. As a rabbit, you don't need to develop a sense of loyalty to your peers. If a predator attacks, you don't stick around and try to defend your colony. You run. Otherwise, you become prey too. As a result, rabbits, and our selected species in general, find little value in demonstrating loyalty to other members of their group. There's no survival advantage in it. Wolves, however, have everything to gain from it. A clash with a rival pack of wolves would require them to distinguish friend from foe and act accordingly. There's a limited supply of wolves, and much energy and attention goes into the nurturing of each one. The emphasis of quality over quantity means that each wolf has a greater value to other members of the pack, unlike rabbits, who tend towards being expendable for the greater good rather than necessary for it. As a result, wolves will risk themselves to defend their pack, something a rabbit would never do. Wolves are also of greater value to each other as they work together to hunt and defend their territory and so on. Rabbits don't require other rabbits to help them eat grass. They're also of no help to each other in fighting off predators. In-group loyalty makes little sense to the R-selected individual. And while rabbits remain unfazed by the death of a companion, wolves demonstrate grief and mourning, and what can only be considered sadness at their loss. Number 8. Competitiveness. Once again, there is no need for competition between rabbits. It's a redundant requirement. Why fight over a patch of grass when you can just turn around and eat the grass that's behind you? When resources are abundant, there's no evolutionary advantage in fighting over them. And why figure out who the toughest rabbit is if he's just going to run away like all the others at the slightest sign of danger? Where there's no real skill set, there's no need to demonstrate one's skill. The R strategy is therefore averse to competition. The K strategy, however, welcomes competition. When a pack works together to hunt, it makes sense to figure out who the best hunter is so that they can take the lead. Competition serves this purpose. When there's a confrontation with another pack, it makes sense to know who are the toughest wolves. Competition not only allows the members of the pack to establish a pecking order, but also serves as a means to practice skills through such behaviors as play fighting, which is a form of competitive behavior. Again, we can see how different environmental pressures lead to the development of mechanisms to more effectively deal with them. In the R strategy, competition serves no useful purpose, whereas in the K strategy, it's essential for survival. Which brings us to point number 9. A natural consequence of competition is hierarchy. In fact, competition is the tool used to establish a hierarchy and determine one's position in it. So once again, leading on from the previous point, rabbits, and R-selected individuals in general are averse to hierarchy. They have no need for it. Wolves, however, depend on it, and every aspect of their lives is governed by it. In fact, their evolutionary trajectory is so driven by it that the individuals at the top of the hierarchy, the alpha males and females, are the only ones that get to mate and reproduce. The final distinguishing behavior we shall look at is risk-taking, with R strategists being risk-inclined and K strategists risk-averse. The simple reason for this is that the ratio of potential gain to loss for an R strategist is large, while for the K strategist only small. For the R, the benefit to risk-taking may be further access to abundant resources, a large gain, with a potential loss of one animal that is quickly and easily replaced, a small loss. However, the K's environment does not provide such a great gain, as the resources are more scarce and the potential loss is considerable, as each animal takes far much more time and energy to replace. Although until now we've been treating R and K as separate life strategies, particular to and shared by all the individuals of a species, we must also understand that there is considerable fluidity between them. According to a paper by two researchers from the Vrije University in Brussels, the population dynamics and selection strategies of a species will often develop through 3 consecutive stages. 1. A nearly exponential growth phase dominated by the factor R, which, if you remember, is the rate of growth. 2. An intermediate phase where the speed of growth switches from increasing to decreasing. 3. Finally, a maturity phase where the growth slows down to 0, which is dominated by the fixed ceiling K, or carrying capacity. If we focus on the 2 extreme phases, they tell us, we find 2 contrasting types of population dynamics that in evolution correspond to what is called respectively R selection and K selection. This fluidity over time, due to changing population and environmental pressures, also takes place within the same species due to individuals or groups experiencing diversely different circumstances. In the same paper, we are told, researchers discovered 2 varieties of the same opossum species, one living on the continent where they're threatened by predators, one on an island where their life is more safe. It turned out that even in captivity, the island variety lived longer and had fewer offspring, i.e. followed more of a K strategy than its mainland cousin. This can nowhere be observed more clearly than with humans, where the key factors that trigger the R or K tendencies can differ enormously between cultures, countries, and even neighborhoods and individuals, being altered by things such as access to resources and exposure to conflict and instability. While intergenerational fluidity can be explained in terms of natural selection and a refinement of the gene pool of any species from generation to generation in response to long-term environmental changes, the current biological understanding as to what allows for this fluidity within the context of an individual lifetime is based upon something known as epigenetics. Epigenetic changes are modifications of the expression of genes rather than alterations of the genetic code itself, and once again take place as a response to environmental factors. It would seem that the DNA of many, if not all species, somehow encodes both the R and the K strategies, and the unique set of environmental pressures faced by each individual organism causes the expression or suppression of certain genes that tend towards one or the other behavior. As humans then, our gestation and childhood, as well as ongoing life experience, is constantly refining the expression of our genes by turning them on or off, which in turn modifies our behavior, and as we shall soon see, our psychological predispositions, beliefs, and ideologies. In order to avoid the multiple repetitions of wordy phrases to describe the movement towards the R or K strategy of any individual or population, I propose 2 new terms to more succinctly encapsulate this idea: Rification and Kification, which simply employs the suffix ification, which means the process of becoming, and is familiar to us all from many other words that use it. So given that certain behaviors can be impacted by environmental changes that epigenetically modify the expression of our genes, to what extent could a population's behavior be altered by the intentional engineering of environmental factors that favor the development of R or K tendencies? And if you were a ruler or despot who wished to subjugate a population to your authority and ensure that they obey your orders without rebellion, just what kind of population would you think to be best suited for this? A nation of wolves or a nation of rabbits? To understand the possibility of the epigenetic engineering of a population towards one or the other behavioral strategy, we must first understand the means by which that might be accomplished. In their paper, Hayleihen and Bernheim tell us, people raised in a stressful environment exhibit typical R traits, such as many and early sexual contacts, large families, risk-taking, and short life expectancy. In a safe environment, they will typically have lower fertility and higher life expectancy, and invest in long-term benefits such as education. So perhaps the first and most obvious method would be to alter the environment of the organisms in question. As we can see here, by increasing environmental stress upon an organism, by increasing conflict and instability, an epigenetic modification of genes occurs that enhances our selective behaviors. Secondly, if a particular behavior itself is facilitated or encouraged, this too can trigger epigenetic adaptation that results in a more powerful biological imperative to engage in those same behaviors. So if early sexual experiences are characteristic of the R strategist and the age of consent is lowered, facilitating sexual activity at a younger age, then once again, the R strategy is reinforced. So effectively, two methods can be used to achieve the same ends: modification of the environment and modification of behavior. Both serve to epigenetically impact an organism and push it towards either the expression of R or K-type behaviors. The key difference between influencing behaviors directly or making those same behaviors an innate part of an organism's reproductive life strategy is that once it becomes innate, the original influences no longer have to be maintained and exerted, and also, where the first is achieved through trends, fashions, or cultural norms that can be accepted or rejected, the second is the result of unconscious biological imperatives that are far more difficult to resist. So if there exists a motive and a method, just how exactly is it being executed? At least since Lenin famously said, "Destroy the family and you destroy society," there has been a concerted effort, most obviously seen in the Western world, to undermine the concept and value of the traditional family. Usually dressed up in political ideals, from communism to socialism, Marxism, neo-Marxism, LGBT rights and feminism, the destruction of the traditional family is not even a concealed ambition, but instead quite openly and proudly stated to be the determined goal of many groups. Lenin, of course, wasn't warning us. He was openly stating what he intended to do. His justification was the birthing of a new society from the ruins of the old one. But just as you might be hesitant to allow someone to tear down your house just on the promise that they will build a better one in its place, many people were reluctant to destroy both their families and societies to give it a go. If you also found out that the man promising you a new house had never built one before in his whole entire life, you'd be entirely justified in sending him briskly on his way. So why does an insane promise like this or others like it even find serious consideration amongst rational thinking beings? Is it perhaps because human populations are made up of individuals who tend both towards R and K strategies? The death of the family and the chaos that ensues is a blessing to R selection. It means a lifting of certain restrictions to breeding, while the environmental instability is just where the R-selected individual most thrives. One of the first decrees of the Soviet government was to abolish the term illegitimate child, and at the same time pass laws that made divorce a simple affair. These initiatives were all carried out, as they still are today, under the guise of helping women and children. Yet by all reasonable measures, they brought with them only chaos, promiscuity, abandoned and unwanted children, rampant abortion, and conflict between the sexes. It would only be a reasonable question to ask ourselves if these consequences were unintended, or perhaps the very goal of the social reforms that caused them. More so perhaps considering that closer to home, the continuation of this agenda is still underway, primarily heralded by certain proponents of feminism. In her 1969 essay, Female Liberation as the Basis for Social Revolution, Roxanne Dunbar asks us in no uncertain terms, how will the family unit be destroyed? And then goes on to tell us how the demand alone will throw the whole ideology of the family into question, so that women can begin establishing a community of work with each other, and we can fight collectively. Women will feel freer to leave their husbands and become economically independent, either through a job or welfare. You might be quite happy, as I am, to see women free to work in whatever field they choose, or to not work and raise their family as they see fit. What's not at all clear is why it would require the destruction of the family in order to happen. The fact that these two things are presented as if by necessity depending one on the other tells me that either her reasoning was unintentionally faulty, or that perhaps she was employing a common trick of persuasion, the placing of one idea that few will disagree with alongside another that you wish to convince people of. And as you can see, there are many more that think like her. You might think these are just fringe fanatics, or that I'm cherry-picking the data. And while it's true that most people who call themselves feminists are simply doing so to support the idea of equality between the sexes, the brazen call to destroy the family is a common theme throughout much of the foundational literature of modern feminism, and many of the individuals and organizations that promote it do so thanks to government subsidies and public funding. But just why would governments have a hand in such things? This destruction of the family is taking place in many ways, underpinned by ideologies that see the traditional family as oppressive to women, outdated, and no longer necessary to modern society. Its demise is being accomplished using a number of different methods. What begun in Russia and has spread to the West and elsewhere is first the loosening of the legislative binds that once held families together. Added to this is the push to remove the stigma once attached to divorce, single parenting, or illegitimate children, even to the extent of celebrating and glorifying these things.
So you're a single mom?
Yes.
I'm a single mom. Well done.
Surviving and thriving as a single mother.
So where's the dad? And I'm like, you mean the donor? And people have this look on their face like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she just said it like that. And I'm like, I'm not ashamed of it.
When once a man and woman's roles were separate and complementary, now they have become adversarial. When once our children were cared for and raised primarily by their parents and immediate family, now this same job is being done by daycare centers and schools. Instead of government benefits being allocated to families for staying together, it's single mothers who are rewarded by the state with monetary allowances given for each child they have. Unfortunately, not only does this support vulnerable women who perhaps have been abandoned by their partners and who rightfully require help and support, but it also facilitates and incentivizes women to leave their husbands and partners or have children without their assistance in order to receive these benefits. Due to the cumulative effect of these factors, and as we can see in the graph, which is reflective of the trend throughout the West, divorce rates have increased dramatically over the last 100 years or so, and the worldwide rate of divorce has increased by over 250% since 1960. The family unit is also being undermined by the promotion of alternative sexual orientations and the breakdown of gender roles. People should no doubt be at liberty to pursue the lifestyle of their choice, and consenting adults should be free to engage in whatever type of sexual activity they choose. But why do modern societies find themselves in the position of having their governments and educational systems proactively promoting and subsidizing these things? Why are the media giants constantly forcing the issue down our throats? With the gay community accounting for a mere 3 to 4% of the population at most, and the transgender community less than 1%, why is there so much airtime and media coverage given to this issue? If the question is one of equal human rights, then why is this issue so pervasive throughout the very societies that have conceded equal human rights to these minorities decades ago? And what has any of this to do with drag queen story time being hosted in our schools and libraries?
Who wants to be a drag queen when they grow up?
Or the insistence on teaching LGBT history and sexuality to children as young as 4.
And it aims to teach kids about the different types of families that they might encounter, and that means talking to kids as young as 4 about the concept of having 2 daddies, say, or 2 mummies. And
if sex is a private affair only for adults, why do our governments and educational systems insist on making it a public affair involving our children? If the issue is equal rights, then why are these minority groups now receiving special privileges, such as can be seen in Canadian Bill C-16, which legislates the use of language, and in particular the preferred pronouns of transgender people? Why are no other groups protected by law from the possibility of offence from others? In Spain, a series of legislations supposedly designed to prevent homophobia not only dictates special benefits to be given to companies that promote the LGBT agenda, but also inverts the presumption of innocence when a member of the LGBT community accuses another of a hate crime, placing the burden of proof not on the accuser to demonstrate the guilt of the accused, but on the accused to demonstrate their own innocence. This is a shocking inversion of the presumption of innocence that any fair justice system is founded upon. For our selected organisms, there is no need for a family structure. In fact, it only interferes with the indiscriminate and incessant breeding that is of most benefit to them. The destruction of the family, then, is an attractive proposal to only the most R-selected of us. These are the so-called useful idiots of the controlling elites, who are unwittingly championing their plans and fighting for their implementation. For the rest of us, it's an uncomfortable imposition that is at first tolerated, but over time becomes more and more acceptable as the more K-selected are pushed towards these R behaviors through biological adaptation to their surroundings and the R triggers that they are constantly bombarded with. A complementary means to undermine the family and push populations towards R selection is the confusion and subversion of gender roles, an essential objective of both LGBT and feminist groups. It can be observed that among K-selected populations, there is a strong differentiation of gender roles. Amongst wolves, the female tends to the young, whilst the male takes the lead in hunting. As the pups grow older, the father will play a more direct role in their upbringing by teaching them the skills needed to hunt and survive. Amongst the most R-selected creatures, however, such as frogs, there is no family structure whatsoever and no role differentiation between the sexes. Amongst rabbits, there is only a short period of maternal care of the offspring, while the father plays no role at all. Due to this situation, and compared to K-selected organisms, female rabbits are considerably masculine, as their role also involves the protection of the young, with no male to defend them and their offspring, whilst the males are more feminine, as they have no need to display the typically male traits of strength, courage, or leadership. Once again, we can see that our selection has no need for defined gender roles. In fact, they are even averse to them. As R triggers, the undermining of gender roles serves to push our tendencies. Hence, it may come as no surprise that Facebook now offers its users over 50 different genders to choose from in the US and over 70 in the UK, including such things as pangender and gender fluid. And if 71 genders isn't enough, there's still the option of other for all those other genders yet to be dreamed up. If you thought that this was perhaps just an amusing gimmick of a social media giant to attract publicity, you'd be wrong. The state of New York now legally recognizes 31 separate genders, with more to come. The Netherlands has issued a gender-neutral passport. Germany legally allows for an indeterminate gender at birth, and Canada has issued its first health card with no gender designation. As should be clear, none of these changes have been motivated by the population at large, but are instead being imposed upon them by our governments and so-called authorities. Modern Western society has now moved beyond the mere masculinization of women and the feminization of men, and is now launching an all-out assault on the idea of gender itself. And notwithstanding science, it now proclaims that there is no such thing as male or female, and that one's gender is whatever one feels it to be. This perhaps would be shocking enough if only indulged in by consenting adults. However, the extent of its influence is more disturbing still. We are now collectively undergoing the normalization of transsexual children, who, although too young to vote, drive, drink, smoke or have sex, are old enough, it would seem, to decide that they are the opposite gender to the one they were born as. Our governments and medical authorities are of course supporting this by facilitating hormone treatment and surgery for them, and even legislating laws against parents who refuse to acknowledge their child's new gender. As we have seen, our selected animals lack a coherent family structure, as well as clearly defined gender roles. We've also seen how the undermining of family structure and gender roles can serve as epigenetic triggers to further promote the expression of our selective behavior. Also, when we look at the multitude of ways in which family values and gender roles are being eroded away, we can notice that we're not dealing with isolated cases, but rather a concerted global effort that's not the result of a natural grassroots growth upwards, but rather an elite agenda coming from the top down and forcing cultural change through the manipulation of government legislation, education and mainstream media, and public health. As we have already seen, one of the fundamental differences between an R and K individual is sexual behavior. Whereas R tends towards frequent and indiscriminate promiscuity from a young age, K engages in selective and less frequent sex beginning at a relatively older age, often within the bounds of pair-bonded monogamy. It would therefore follow that if we wish to push any individual or population towards our selection, one effective way to do it would be to manipulate their sexual behavior towards that favored by our strategists. There is little doubt that over the last few decades there has been a societal trend towards an ever greater permissiveness of sexual behaviours that previously had been considered unacceptable. What was once deviant and perverse has now become commonplace, and what was once an aberration is now politely tolerated and protected by all-encompassing and cliched maxims to the effect of, as long as they're not harming anyone, let them get on with it. Since the 60s broke down the conservative sexual attitudes of the 50s into the decade of free love and free lust, our exposure to sexuality in almost every aspect of life has been steadily on the rise. Through film, fashion, music, art, literature, advertising, politics, TV, social media and the internet, we are bombarded with sexual imagery, nudity, seduction and titillation. Every form of sexual gratification has now been normalized and even glorified, and not merely just those of a heterosexual nature. Gay, lesbian, bi, self-love and masturbation, we are constantly reassured, if it feels good, it's okay. Go ahead. The creed of the sexual hedonist has been accepted by every hip modern man and woman, if only in theory rather than practice. Conversely, more conservative and restrained views about sex are seen through the lens of conventional mainstream culture to be old-fashioned, square, and just not cool. The National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, published in The Lancet and carried out once every 10 years over 3 consecutive decades, tells us that although the frequency of intercourse has remained relatively stable over this period, even decreasing slightly, we can also see that the average age of first intercourse has consistently fallen, with only 15% of men and 4% of women born in the 1950s having had sex before the age of 16, compared to 31% of men, just over double, and 29% of women, an increase of over 700% in 2010. The average number of sexual partners of people aged 16 to 44 has increased from 8.6 to 11.7 for men, and more than doubled for women, from 3.7 to 7.7. This data is of course consistent with the increased promiscuity and earlier onset of sexual activity to be expected through arification. As for the top-down influence in all of this, one of the principal players given credit for defining our current liberal views to sex, and often considered to be one of the main influences in blowing the doors wide open for the sexual revolution of the 60s, was the sexologist Alfred Kinsey. He is widely regarded as the first major figure in sexology, and is perhaps best known for his 2 books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, published in 1948 and 1953, and also known as the Kinsey Reports. His work and influence was primarily funded by American tax dollars through the National Institute of Mental Health, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation, another key player behind the globalist agenda of arification. Kinsey's findings and publications were publicized far and wide and impacted deeply on the general population's attitudes and ideas about sex. In more recent years, however, he has been exposed as a deeply disturbed individual and sexual deviant who indulged in increasingly painful masochistic techniques, homosexuality, paedophilia, and wife and husband swapping with his colleagues at the Kinsey Institute, much of which was filmed in the attic of his home. Much of Kinsey's work has also been exposed to be fraudulent and his team unqualified. Although their work claimed to interview the American population at large so as to collate data as to what constituted normal sexual behavior, their samples included a high percentage of prostitutes, prison inmates and sex offenders, as documented in Dr. Judith Reisman's book, Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, The Indoctrination of a People, and elsewhere. In effect, much of Kinsey's work served to present deviant sexual practices to the general public as the standard behavior of every American man and woman. In 1964, the Kinsey Institute founded SIECUS, the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, and the educational arm of their organization, whose first director was Dr. Mary Calderone, the former medical director of Planned Parenthood. SIECUS now works hand in hand with UNESCO to establish the international guidelines on sexual education in schools all around the world. In a 1980 Time magazine article called Attacking the Last Taboo, the co-founder of SIECUS and the co-author of the Kinsey Reports, Wardell Pomeroy, is quoted saying, "It is time to admit that incest need not be a perversion or a symptom of mental illness," and "Incest between children and adults can sometimes be beneficial." In the same article, John Money, another SIECUS board member, said, "Childhood sexual experience such as being the partner of a relative or of an older person need not necessarily affect the child adversely." Money had also advocated in his 1975 book Sexual Signatures that explicit sexual pictures can and should be used as part of a child's sex education. As for Kinsey's sexual behavior in the human female, in Chapter 4 entitled Pre-Adolescent Sexual Development, we find, "There are of course instances of adults who have done physical damage to children with whom they have attempted sexual contacts, but these cases are in the minority, and the public should learn to distinguish such serious contacts from other adult contacts which are not likely to do the child any appreciable harm if the child's parents do not become disturbed. We have only one clear-cut case of serious injury done to the child, and a very few instances of vaginal bleeding, which, however, did not appear to do any appreciable damage." According to Kinsey, not only must the public be conditioned to accept such sexual contacts as normal, but so must children. It is difficult to understand why a child, except for its cultural conditioning, should be disturbed at having its genitalia touched, or disturbed at even more specific sexual contacts. Chapter 5 of his book on human male sexuality deals with the nature of sexual response in the activities of pre-adolescent boys. Kinsey then goes on to present us with the data from several thousand histories from older subjects who have had sexual contacts with younger boys. Many of the descriptions of this illegal and criminal activity is clearly abusive and describes the children involved sobbing, fighting to get away from the partner, and making violent attempts to avoid climax. These chapters make for nauseating reading to any normal human being, and what should have been the basis for a widespread investigation into child abuse and exposed as junk science, instead laid the groundwork for the discipline of sexology, as well as our modern approach to sex education. Indeed, what is most disturbing of all with regards to societal hypersexualization is that it's being inflicted upon our children. The dividing line between childhood and adulthood is slowly being erased, and what was once adult culture is now being sold to children thanks to the influence of fashion, film, music, and social media. There is now even a term to describe this: corporate paedophilia.
Corporate pedophilia is the action taken by corporations to sell products to children in a sexualized way.
One only has to listen to the music they are exposed to, the fashion trends they follow, and the extreme concern for appearance that is slowly becoming the norm amongst tweens and teenagers, especially girls, to see that the days of childhood innocence are quickly becoming a thing of the past. When we consider that all of these things are taking place from the top down through government sex education, multinational corporate influence, mainstream media, the fashion and music industries, and social media giants, we see that once again, these are trends that are not the result of natural human development, but rather the result of an agenda to steer humanity in a certain direction. Is it any coincidence then that all of these influences once again are pushing us collectively towards greater R-selection? One of the main factors serving to unleash the sexual revolution, and in particular the sexual liberation of women, has been the development of and access to cheaper and easier contraceptive methods. And even when these fail, abortion has become an ever more easily obtainable option. These two things combined have allowed those in modern societies to have sex like rabbits without suffering the consequences of having to care for the offspring that it would have otherwise produced. In effect, at a very deep biological level, it artificially allows for humans to indulge in behaviors that would only ever be viable to extremely R-selected animals. Even for rabbits, the fulfillment of the sexual act creates with it the obligation to invest a short period of time in tending to their young. We'd have to go as far as an extremely R-selected creature such as a frog to reach the complete lack of consequence of the sexual act that humans have managed to arrive at artificially thanks to contraception. As should now be quite clear to us, the acting out of R-selected behaviors triggers further R-ification in any individual or population. While contraception might well be considered as a boon to modern society by allowing for greater control over our reproductive capacities, abortion, while allowing for the avoidance of unwanted parenthood, has a very high moral price to pay. Even its most ardent supporters admit that it's an unfortunate option, the lesser of two evils, and something to only be turned to as a last resort. How have our governments and medical authorities responded to this dilemma? Well, for the most part, they have legislated in its favour and provided for the medical treatment which can, in most Western countries, now be obtained through the public health system, paid from public funds. But K-selected individuals are highly prized. A K-selected individual, whether fetus, baby, child or adult, is the most valued thing within the K society. It may then come as no surprise to realize that only in progressively more R-selected populations does one's offspring become expendable. A frog has no idea, nor even the slightest care as to the fate of her spawn once it has been laid. A rabbit only slightly more.
Abortion is a medical procedure. It is not a crime.
Abortion, then, the biological act and the psychological condition that tolerates it as a viable option, can only serve once more to reinforce and amplify the epigenetic signals of R-selection. Just how far this can be taken remains to be seen. Currently around 56 million abortions take place yearly, something comparable to the entire population of Italy. This works out at more than 153,000 abortions a day. At present, many groups throughout the US and elsewhere, unsatisfied it would seem with the requirement to undergo abortion within the first months of pregnancy, are fighting to pass legislation that would allow a woman to abort her baby right up to the moment of birth.
Where it's obvious that a woman is about to give birth, she has physical signs that she is about to give a birth. Would that still be a point at which she could request an abortion if she was so certified? She's dilating.
Mr. Chairman, that would be a decision that the doctor, the physician, and the woman would make.
I understand that. I'm asking
point.
if your bill allows that.
My bill would allow that, yes.
Forget rabbits. There are frogs among us, it would seem. In nature, migration is used as an R strategy for survival that occurs most often when either the resources of a local environment have been exhausted by unsustainable growth and exploitation, or when a population risks collapse due to predation or environmental disaster. When this happens, an R population will flee from the danger to another area where resources are more bountiful, so as to continue to consume and reproduce. K-selection, on the other hand, upon reaching the natural carrying capacity of the local environment, maintains its numbers in balance with the resources available to it, and generally has little to fear from predation. It therefore finds no strategic benefit to migration, and is even averse to the upheaval, stress, and instability that it causes. K's avoid taking the risks of large-scale displacement, while R's wholeheartedly welcome them. What then could possibly be the hidden motivation for the widespread forced migration of people on our planet today? Surely the worldwide funding efforts of mass immigration by globalists like George Soros are wholesome humanitarian projects, and we would be paranoid to think otherwise. These efforts are once again encouraged enthusiastically by the most R-selected individuals in any society, as they are set to gain by an influx of other R-selected individuals, as well as the increasing conflict and instability that this brings. When justifying their stance to others in this regard, for the most part they will claim altruistic motives and concern for the immigrants.
Immigrants are welcome here.
However, the more R-selected an individual is, the less they feel any in-group loyalty to anyone. Hence often the real motivation is purely selfish and based upon the biological urge for their reproductive strategy to dominate. Just as they lack any demonstrable loyalty to their local community, so too do they lack any real concern or loyalty to the immigrants they claim to support. Hence the simpler truth is mere self-interest. According to UN figures, there were around 82 million immigrants in Europe and 59 million in North America in 2019, compared to 57 million and 40 million just 19 years earlier. We are also told that worldwide immigration has increased by almost 100 million since the year 2000, and that more than half of all international migrants lived in Europe or Northern America. And if we look at the top 10 countries with the most immigration, we can see that 7 of them are Western. Is it any coincidence that these are the very same countries that are most traditionally and furthest towards K-selection? It would make sense, of course, to shelter displaced populations from unstable and conflict-ridden countries in places with stable economies free from such conflicts. But what are the consequences exactly of flooding cultures that lean towards K-selection with millions of individuals that tend towards R-selection? Are the global minds behind the modern push for mass immigration really ignorant of this? Or are their plans perhaps even predicated upon it? Given the wider context of the epigenetic engineering of humanity towards R-selectivity and the potential benefits that the elite globalists can derive from it, it would seem to be no accident. If R-selected organisms are designed to exploit situations of abundance, how then are modern economic austerity measures impacting human R populations?
Austerity.
Tory austerity.
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 This is the fundamental debate in this country and across Europe.
At first glance, this may seem inconsistent with an agenda to encourage R selection. However, if we consider that when speaking of abundance in terms of biological reproductive strategies, what is being primarily referred to is food. As such, austerity measures have made little difference to the availability of food and have only affected what biologically speaking can be considered as luxury items. Western societies still continue to enjoy a surplus of food, so much so in fact that many tons of it are thrown away each day. Even the poorest and the homeless have no problem eating, even if it has to be sourced by visiting a soup kitchen, by begging, or even rummaging through dumpsters. There is no reason for anyone to go hungry in modern Western countries, even though many people may be struggling to make ends meet. Add to this the safety net of the social welfare system, and you will be guaranteed abundance in the biological sense for yourself and as many offspring as you care to have. Considering that the social welfare system also serves as an incentive for mothers to go it alone by replacing their child's father with the state, we can see that all of these socially engineered pressures remain consistent with a plan towards the Rification of the general population. In fact, there is an added benefit of austerity measures to this plan, in that they act as further R triggers by generating greater levels of conflict, instability and stress, without affecting the abundance of food sources in the slightest. You may have noticed over recent years a growing concern within some groups with the effects of competition in our societies, and in particular, how it's affecting our children. Far from a means for people to strive towards excellence, develop self-esteem and challenge themselves, or for society to establish who is good at what, instead, competition, they insist, only leads to feelings of inadequacy, jealousy and envy, and should be replaced wholesale with cooperation. Not satisfied to contend with just the negative extremes of competition, Alfie Kohn, author and lecturer in the fields of parenting and education, instead wants us to believe that there is no such thing as healthy competition, and that competition only leads children to envy winners and to dismiss losers. Instead, he tells us, cooperation, on the other hand, is marvelously successful at helping children to communicate effectively, to trust in others, and to accept those who are different from themselves. These words can be found in his book No Contest: The Case Against Competition, which has won several awards, including the National Psychology Award for Excellence in the Media from the American Psychological Association.
Playing sport these days, what is more important? Is it taking part or winning?
But are we really to suppose that this is so black and white, a case of either or, that we must forsake competition entirely for the sake of cooperation? Why not instead promote the healthy aspects of competition as well as the healthy aspects of cooperation? Perhaps only when we remember that competition is anathema to our selected individuals can we begin to see the unconscious biological motivation behind these ideas and others like them, as well as the desire of those in control to promote and spread them. Hand in hand with this drive to do away with competition is the very thing that competition establishes: hierarchy. Hierarchy is what allows for any group or organization to follow the lead of those who are most qualified, and competition is the means in which to establish each individual's level of qualification within the hierarchy. The motivation, however, behind the drive to do away with hierarchy is less about replacing it with something better and more about concerns of inequality and inequity. Lindred Greer, a professor of organizational behavior at Stanford Graduate School of Business, tells us, "I've always said that if there were a Nobel Prize for management, it would go to the person who finds an organizational structure that's not based on vertical differentiation, on hierarchy, on leadership. There have to be ways to organize that don't imply inequality and inequity, ways to organize that are more mutually respectful and reinforcing." Strangely enough, at the forefront of this ideological push are professors within the best universities in the Western world, an ironic situation when one considers that the professor stands at the pinnacle of the educational hierarchy and has only got there by persistent and successful triumph over their rivals. Nevertheless, in the context of RK selection, it's easy to understand, given that our selected individuals are hostile to competition and hierarchy, as it serves them no purpose and even undermines their own reproductive survival strategy. Once upon a time, celebrity and fame was earned through excellence. The ones that graced our TV screens and the front covers of our newspapers and magazines were there because they had excelled in science, music, cinema, art, literature, or politics. They were the trailblazers in their respective fields, masters of their art, the bringers of gifts to humanity. Fame was bestowed upon talent and was not something to be pursued for its own ends. Now just look at us. Fame is pursued desperately with no talent to speak of, nor talent even required, and instead we reward with fame those least deserving of it, the scandalous, the slutty, the lewd, the crass, the obscene. Sleeping with a famous person and then telling all is now a cause for celebrity. Shock value and extreme narcissism is enough, it would seem, these days. Morbid fascination has taken the place of admiration, and now anything goes. Absolutely anything. Reality TV, which started out as fly-on-the-wall insight into the human condition, has now become a free-for-all contest of degradation, where the one with the least scruples, integrity and self-respect wins. And their prize is fame. For a moment they hold the public's gaze, even if only out of contempt and disdain. What can explain this turn of events? Why has excellence been so swiftly and willingly dethroned? To the R, excellence only reminds them of their own inadequacies, whereas the K is reminded of their potential. Greatness humiliates the R, whilst encouraging the K. Rabbits inhabit mediocrity. They are happy to eat and reproduce. There are no great endeavours other than these, nor rewards for pursuing them. Ks, on the other hand, are motivated by their biological imperatives. If wolves possessed language, they would speak of legendary wolves, great hunters who led their packs to glory through the application of intelligence, forethought, courage and skill. If rabbits possessed language, what would they tell us? So once again we can see that the modern celebration of mediocrity and the rejection and undermining of excellence is just another aspect of Rification, indulged in by the most R-selected among us and supported by the agenda to make us all into docile rabbits. While an entire film could have been made from each of the sections that have made up this one, I only hope that at least the underlying scheme has been effectively communicated. I'm sure the more R-selected individuals among us will dismiss these ideas as is to be expected. However, to those of you out there with some K still in their genes, I hope that enough dots have been connected to at least warrant further investigation. I also hope that you may now consider the pushes and pulls of modern society in terms of R and K selection, so as to decide and act more consciously with a more refined awareness of consequence. There is much that has been left unsaid due to limitations of time, such as the rejection of patriotism, the glamorization of risk-taking, the urbanization of modern living that relieves the pressures of ostracization and allows one to indulge in more R-selected behavior. Perhaps now the framework has been given, you may consider these things in your own time. If I have left you with the impression of being in favor of eradicating R-selective behavior entirely, then allow me to address that. As I've said before, R and K behaviors need to be considered as part of a spectrum. Extreme K selection would bring rigidity, dogmatism, inequality and narrow-mindedness, and would lack the freedom that humans require in order to truly thrive. Widespread extreme R selection, on the other hand, would bring about the collapse of civil society as we know it by way of unrestrained hedonism, indulgence, pathological individualism and chaos. Just as any organism must maintain homeostasis in order to survive, I believe that the sprawling organism of humanity requires some measure of equilibrium in order for it to survive and thrive. I don't mean to dismiss R traits in favor of K traits, but rather establish once again some sort of healthy balance between the two. In the war against K, I find myself in the position of defending K. Were it the other way around, I would perhaps be defending R-selective traits instead, always with a view towards dynamic equilibrium. So by all means, honor the R within you, but honor the K too. Make peace with them both and understand when one attempts to overthrow the other. Seek balance, for balance is its own reward. But most important of all, learn to know when your biology is being hacked and used against you for the profit of others. And with awareness, intelligence, and compassion, together we can undo the epigenetic engineering of humanity.